Epictetus, the slave who taught the world how to be free. Hello, my friends. Today, I want to tell you the story of a man who had everything taken from him: his freedom, his body, his rights, his dignity, and who responded by becoming one of the most influential philosophers in the history of the Western world. His name was Epictetus. He was born a slave. He was owned by another human being. He could be beaten, sold, humiliated, and discarded at his master's whim. And yet, from within the absolute constraints of that existence, he developed a philosophy of human freedom so radical, so precise, and so psychologically penetrating that it is still changing people's lives 2,000 years after his death. His ideas have influenced Roman emperors and Christian theologians, Renaissance scholars and Enlightenment thinkers, modern psychologists, and military commanders. The Stoic philosophy he taught and embodied is today one of the fastest growing intellectual movements in the world, embraced by Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, professional athletes, soldiers, and millions of ordinary people who are looking for a way to live with greater clarity, resilience, and purpose. And it all began with a slave in ancient Rome who decided that although he could not control what was done to his body, no one, no master, no emperor, no force in the universe could control what happened inside his mind. So sit back, relax, and let us travel back 2,000 years to the ancient world of Rome and Greece to meet a man who may have more genuinely useful things to say about how to live than almost anyone else who has ever walked this earth. Chapter 1. A World of Masters and Slaves. To understand Epictetus, you must first understand the world into which he was born. A world built, to a degree that is difficult for modern people to fully grasp, on the institution of slavery. The Roman Empire of the 1st century AD was the most powerful political entity the Western world had ever seen. At its peak, it encompassed territories stretching from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. It contained, by most estimates, somewhere between 50 and 70 million people, and of those people, perhaps 20 to 30%, somewhere between 10 and 20 million human beings, were slaves. Roman slavery was not a single, uniform experience. At one extreme were the slaves who worked in the mines or on the agricultural estates. Brutal, exhausting, often lethal labor, performed in conditions of extreme deprivation. These slaves had almost no rights, almost no personal life, and a life expectancy that was brutally short. At the other extreme were educated slaves, often Greeks or people from the Eastern Mediterranean, who had been captured in war or born into slavery, who served as teachers, physicians, administrators, and secretaries in wealthy Roman households. These slaves had a degree of autonomy and even comfort that was entirely absent from the lives of their counterparts in the fields. Epictetus was born into this world around 50 AD in the city of Hierapolis, a prosperous town in what is now Western Turkey, in the region that the Romans called Phrygia. We do not know his birth name. The name Epictetus, which in Greek means simply acquired or gained, was probably a name given to him as a slave, a name that defined him entirely by his status as property. We do not know who his mother was, except that she was almost certainly a slave herself, which meant that Epictetus was born a slave, not captured, not sold into slavery as a result of some misfortune, but born into it, inheriting his status from his mother in the automatic, indifferent way that Roman law prescribed. What we do know is that at some point in his early life, Epictetus was brought to Rome and became the property of a man named Epaphroditus, a freedman, meaning a former slave who had gained his freedom and subsequently risen to considerable power. Epaphroditus was a secretary and administrator to the Emperor Nero, one of the most notoriously tyrannical rulers in Roman history. He was, by all accounts, a man who understood power and was entirely comfortable using it. In the household of Epaphroditus, the young Epictetus would have his first encounter with philosophy, and it would change everything. Chapter 2. The School of Musonius Rufus. Among the educated slaves and freedmen of Rome in the first century, A.D., philosophical education was not unusual. Philosophy, particularly Stoic philosophy, was the dominant intellectual tradition of the Roman educated class, and a household like Epaphroditus's would have had access to philosophical teaching and discussion. Epaphroditus, apparently recognizing something exceptional in his young slave, allowed Epictetus to study with one of the most celebrated Stoic teachers in Rome, a man named Gaius Musonius Rufus. Musonius Rufus was a remarkable figure in his own right. He was a Roman knight, a member of the upper class, who had dedicated his life to philosophy and to the radical proposition that philosophy was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a practical guide to living. He believed and taught that philosophy was for everyone, not just for the wealthy and educated, but for women, for the poor, and, most controversially, for slaves. He believed that the capacity for virtue, which was the highest human good in Stoic philosophy, was available to every human being, regardless of their social status. For Epictetus, studying with Musonius Rufus was a transformative experience. Here was a man teaching that what mattered was not your external circumstances, your wealth, your freedom, your social position, but the quality of your inner life, the choices you made about how to respond to what happened to you. For a slave, this was not merely an interesting philosophical proposition. It was a lifeline. Epictetus absorbed Musonius's teaching with the intensity of a man for whom philosophy was not an academic exercise, but a matter of survival. And he began to develop, within the framework his teacher had given him, a philosophy that was uniquely his own, sharper, more personal, more psychologically acute than anything that had come before. He also had, during this period, a personal encounter with suffering that would stamp itself indelibly on his philosophy. Ancient sources, and we must be honest that our sources for Epictetus's life are limited and not always reliable, tell us that Epaphroditus, his master, once twisted Epictetus's leg, apparently as a demonstration of power, or perhaps as punishment. Epictetus reportedly said to him calmly, "You are going to break it." Epaphroditus continued. The leg broke. Epictetus said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" Whether this story is literally true or a later embellishment, it perfectly captures the philosophy Epictetus would spend his life teaching. He could not prevent his master from breaking his leg. That was outside his control. What he could control was his response. The calm, the absence of panic, the refusal to give his master the satisfaction of seeing him reduced to fear or anger or desperation. His body could be broken. His equanimity could not. Epictetus walked with a limp for the rest of his life. Chapter 3. The Dichotomy of Control. At the heart of Epictetus's philosophy, and at the heart of Stoicism more broadly, is an idea so simple that it can be stated in a single sentence, and yet so profound that a lifetime is not enough to fully master it. It is this: some things are within our control, and some things are not. And the entire art of living well consists in knowing the difference and acting accordingly. Epictetus called this the dichotomy of control, the division of everything in the universe into two categories. In his own words, preserved in the text known as the Enchiridion, or the Handbook, which was compiled by his student Arrian. Some things are in our control and others not. Things in our control are opinion, pursuit, desire, aversion, and, in a word, whatever are our own actions. Things not in our control are body, reputation, command, and, in one word, whatever are not our own actions. Read that again, my friends, and let it sink in, because it is more radical than it first appears. Your body is not in your control. Epictetus does not mean that you should not take care of it. Of course you should. He means that ultimately, your body is subject to illness, injury, aging, and death, and no amount of wishing or planning can change that fundamental fact. You did not choose to be born in the body you have. You did not choose your genetic inheritance. You cannot choose whether disease will visit you or when death will come. These things are, in the deepest sense, not yours. Your reputation is not in your control. What other people think of you depends on factors you cannot fully manage. Their own preconceptions, their moods, their interests, the information they happen to have or not have about you. You can behave with integrity and still be misunderstood. You can work hard and still be overlooked. You can tell the truth and still be called a liar. Other people's opinions of you are ultimately their business, not yours. Your wealth, your social position, your relationships, the behavior of other people, the political situation of your country, the weather. None of these are truly in your control. They are subject to forces far larger than yourself, and to place your happiness in their hands is to make yourself permanently vulnerable to circumstances you cannot govern. What is in your control? Only this: how you choose to think about what happens to you, what you decide to value, what you choose to pursue, and what you choose to avoid. How you respond, internally, in the privacy of your own mind, to the events of your life. This is your kingdom. This, and only this, is truly yours. And here, within this narrow but absolute sovereignty, you are completely free. No master, no emperor, no circumstance can enter here without your permission. For Epictetus the slave, this was not a comfortable philosophical abstraction. It was the truth that made his life livable. His body was owned. His freedom of movement was owned. But his mind, his judgments, his values, his responses, these were his own, and no one could take them. Chapter 4. Freedom in Chains. Epictetus was eventually granted his freedom. We do not know exactly when or under what circumstances. It is possible that Epaphroditus freed him voluntarily. It is possible that Epictetus purchased his freedom somehow. Ancient sources are not clear on this point. What we know is that after gaining his freedom, Epictetus began to teach philosophy in Rome. He was not a wealthy man and never would be. He lived simply. Ancient sources describe his home as containing little more than a straw mat, a lamp, and the most basic necessities. He was lame from the injury his master had inflicted. He was not a physically imposing figure, but when he spoke, people listened. His teaching style was distinctive and, for the time, unusual. He did not lecture in the formal, rhetorical style that was fashionable among Roman philosophers. He talked directly, personally, sometimes sharply, sometimes with humor, always with an intensity that made his students feel they were being spoken to as individuals rather than as an audience. He asked questions. He challenged. He provoked. He had, by all accounts, the ability to make a person feel in the course of a single conversation that their entire way of thinking about their life needed to be reconsidered. He was also, in certain moods, quite funny. Several of his recorded sayings have a dry, almost sardonic wit that feels surprisingly modern. When a student came to him complaining that his brother was angry with him and refusing to be reconciled, Epictetus asked, "And who gave you the job of managing your brother's emotions?" When someone worried about what people would think of them, Epictetus asked, "Why do you care about the opinion of people you wouldn't take advice from?" In 89 AD, the Emperor Domitian, one of the more paranoid and tyrannical rulers in Roman history, expelled all philosophers from Rome. This was not the first time philosophers had been expelled from Roman territory, and it would not be the last. Rulers who were insecure about their power have always been uncomfortable around people who teach others to think clearly and independently. Epictetus left Rome and settled in the town of Nicopolis in what is now northwestern Greece. There he established a school and continued to teach for the rest of his long life. And it was in Nicopolis that his most famous student found him. Chapter 5. The student who remembered everything, Epictetus wrote nothing. This is one of the most remarkable facts about one of the most influential philosophers in Western history. Everything we know of his teaching comes to us through a student, a young Roman man named Arrian, Nicomedia, who attended Epictetus' school at Nicopolis and took careful, detailed notes of his teacher's lectures and conversations. Arrian compiled these notes into 2 works. The Discourses, a longer collection of Epictetus' teachings, of which 4 books survive out of an original 8, and the Enchiridion, or Handbook, a shorter summary of the most essential points, designed as a practical guide for daily life. Arrian was not a casual student. He was deeply serious about philosophy and deeply devoted to his teacher. He wrote in his introduction to the Discourses that he had tried to capture not just Epictetus' words, but his manner, the directness, the urgency, the personal quality of his speech. Whether he fully succeeded, we cannot know. But what has come down to us is vivid, immediate, and strikingly alive. It reads less like a philosophy textbook than like a conversation with a remarkably wise and somewhat impatient friend. The Enchiridion begins with the dichotomy of control, which we discussed earlier, but it goes on to develop a full philosophy of life. Practical, detailed, and psychologically sophisticated in ways that continue to astonish modern readers. On desire, Epictetus taught that most human suffering comes from desiring things we cannot control. We desire wealth, health, the affection of specific people, success in our careers, the good opinion of our neighbors. When these desires are frustrated, as they inevitably are because they depend on things outside our control, we suffer. The Stoic solution is not to stop wanting things, but to redirect desire toward things we can actually control. Our own choices, our own character, our own responses to events. Want to be a person of integrity? You can have that. Want the promotion? You might not get it. And tying your happiness to it is a recipe for suffering. On fear. Most of what we fear is not the thing itself, but our judgment about the thing. Death is not terrible. Our opinion that death is terrible is what causes us suffering. Poverty is not unbearable. Our belief that poverty is unbearable is what makes it so. Change your judgments, and you change your experience of the world. On relationships. Love the people in your life, Epictetus taught, but love them while remembering that they are mortal, that they will change, that they may leave or die. When you kiss your child goodnight, remind yourself gently that this child is mortal, that nothing is guaranteed. This is not morbidity. It is a practice of presence and gratitude. The person who truly understands the fragility of what they love is the person who is most fully alive to its value. On insult. When someone insults you, Epictetus asked, where exactly is the harm? An insult is just words, just air. It can only harm you if you choose to accept it, if you internalize it, if you allow it to alter your self-perception. If someone calls you a fool and you are not a fool, what have you lost? If someone calls you a fool and you are a fool, well, now you know something useful. Either way, the insult itself is nothing. Chapter 6. The Inner Citadel. One of the most powerful images in Epictetus' philosophy and in Stoic philosophy more broadly, is what the later Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius would call the inner citadel, the fortress of the self, the space within the mind that cannot be invaded by external events. Epictetus returned to this image again and again in his teaching, and it is easy to understand why. For a man who had been a slave, who had experienced firsthand what it meant to have his external freedom completely stripped away, the existence of an inner space that remained inviolably free was not a metaphor. It was the most concrete and urgent truth he knew. He taught his students that the philosopher's task, and for Epictetus, everyone should be a philosopher, in the sense of someone who thinks carefully about how to live, was to build and defend this inner citadel. To identify, with increasing clarity and precision, what belongs to you and what does not. To stop wasting energy trying to control what cannot be controlled, and to invest that energy instead in the one domain where your sovereignty is complete, your own mind. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires constant practice, constant vigilance, constant willingness to examine your own reactions and ask, is this response appropriate? Am I suffering because of something that actually happened, or because of my judgment about what happened? Am I trying to control something that is not mine to control? Epictetus gave his students practical exercises to develop this capacity. Before getting out of bed in the morning, remind yourself of what the day will bring, that you will encounter rude people, frustrating circumstances, things that do not go as planned. Prepare yourself in advance so that when these things happen, you are not ambushed by them. This practice, which the Stoics called the premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, is now recognized by modern psychologists as a genuinely effective technique for building psychological resilience. When something bad happens, pause before reacting. Create a small space between the event and your response. In that space, ask, is this within my control? If yes, what is the best action I can take? If no, how can I accept it with equanimity rather than fighting a battle I cannot win? When you find yourself desperately wanting something, a particular outcome, a particular person's approval, a particular result, ask yourself, am I placing my happiness in the hands of something outside my control? And if so, what would it look like to redirect that energy towards something I can actually govern? These are not complicated questions, but living them, actually living them in the daily friction and frustration of real life, is one of the most demanding practices a human being can undertake. Epictetus knew this. He never pretended it was easy. What he insisted was that it was possible and that it was worth it. Chapter 7: God, Duty, and the Cosmic Community. Epictetus was not merely a psychologist of personal resilience. He was a philosopher with a complete vision of the universe and humanity's place within it. Like all Stoics, Epictetus believed in a rational, ordered universe, governed by a principle the Stoics called the logos, a Greek word that means reason, or word, or order. The universe, in Stoic thought, is not a collection of random events, but a coherent whole, governed by rational principles that human beings, with sufficient effort, can understand and align themselves with. Epictetus used the word God, theos in Greek, to describe this rational ordering principle. He was not describing the personal, interventionist God of later Christianity, who answers prayers and performs miracles. He was describing something more like the rational structure of reality itself, the laws of nature, the logic that underlies existence. But he spoke of this God with a warmth and a personal feeling that gives his philosophy a quality that is almost devotional. He taught that human beings are part of a larger community, not just the community of their city or their empire, but the community of all rational beings in the universe. He used the Stoic concept of cosmopolitanism, the idea that every human being is a citizen of the world, not just of their particular country or tribe, to argue that we have duties to one another that transcend the accidents of birth and social status. This was, in the 1st century AD, a radical idea. Roman society was deeply hierarchical, deeply divided along lines of class, gender, and legal status. The idea that a slave and a senator were equally members of the human community, equally deserving of moral consideration, equally capable of virtue, was not merely unconventional. It was subversive, and Epictetus meant it. He had lived it. He knew from the inside what it meant to be treated as less than fully human, and he had concluded, from that experience, not that some people mattered less, but that every person, in the depths of their rational nature, carried the same fundamental dignity. His teaching on this point would prove enormously influential on early Christian thinkers, who found in Stoic cosmopolitanism a philosophical framework that resonated deeply with their own belief in the equal spiritual worth of every human soul. Chapter 8. The Emperor's Philosopher. In the 2nd century AD, a young Roman boy was given a copy of Epictetus's discourses by his tutor. The boy read it with the intensity of someone encountering, for the first time, ideas that articulated something he had already half known, but never been able to express clearly. That boy grew up to become the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in the history of the world, ruler of an empire of 50 million people, commander of the greatest military force of his era, and throughout his reign spent largely on campaign, fighting wars on the northern frontier. He kept a private journal in which he wrestled, day after day, with the ideas he had first encountered in Epictetus. That journal, which Marcus wrote in Greek and never intended for publication, has come down to us under the title Meditations. It is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of human thought. The private spiritual diary of an emperor who was trying, imperfectly and honestly, to live by the philosophy of a former slave. The connection between Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius is one of the most remarkable in intellectual history. They never met. Epictetus died before Marcus was born, or when Marcus was very young. But the ideas passed from teacher to student across time, losing nothing of their urgency or their practical force. Marcus quotes Epictetus repeatedly, returns to his central ideas constantly, and uses the Stoic framework Epictetus had given him to navigate the almost unimaginable pressures of ruling a vast empire in a time of constant war, plague, and political crisis. Marcus was not a perfect Stoic. He was the first to admit this, repeatedly in the Meditations. He found it hard not to care about his reputation. He found it hard to be patient with people who frustrated him. He found it hard to face the deaths of his children. He and his wife Faustina lost several children in infancy and childhood, with the equanimity that Epictetus had taught. But he kept trying. He kept returning to the philosophy. He kept asking himself the questions Epictetus had taught him to ask. And in doing so, he became, by almost universal historical judgment, one of the best rulers the Roman Empire ever had. The slave had taught the emperor, and the emperor had listened. Chapter 9. The Legacy That Will Not Die. Epictetus died sometime around 135 AD in Nicopolis. He was, by all accounts, very old, perhaps 80 or older. He had spent the last decades of his life teaching, living simply, and exemplifying in his own person the philosophy he taught. Ancient sources tell us that in his old age he adopted a child, the infant of a friend who could not afford to raise it. For a man who had spent his life teaching the irrelevance of external goods, this act of practical compassion is enormously revealing. Stoicism, as Epictetus practiced it, was not a philosophy of detachment or indifference. It was a philosophy of appropriate engagement, caring deeply about the things that were genuinely important, while refusing to be enslaved by the things that were not. His school at Nicopolis continued to attract students from across the Roman world after his death. His ideas, preserved in Arrian's compilation, circulated widely and influenced thinkers in every subsequent century. In the Renaissance, Stoic philosophy, including Epictetus, was rediscovered and enthusiastically embraced by thinkers across Europe. In the Enlightenment, figures such as Montaigne, Descartes, and later Kant drew on Stoic ideas. In the 20th century, the psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, himself a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps, developed a school of psychotherapy called logotherapy that draws heavily on Stoic principles, particularly the Epictetan insight that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can always choose our response. In the 1950s and 1960s, the American psychologist Albert Ellis developed rational emotive behavior therapy, one of the most effective evidence-based psychotherapies ever developed, and acknowledged explicitly that his central insight had come directly from reading Epictetus. It is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about events. Today, Stoicism is experiencing a remarkable popular revival. Books about Stoic philosophy regularly appear on bestseller lists. Millions of people practice what has been called modern Stoicism, applying the principles of Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius to challenges ranging from anxiety and depression to professional performance and leadership. The Silicon Valley culture of what is called mental toughness draws heavily, if sometimes unconsciously, on Stoic ideas. And the Aegis Enchiridion, the little handbook compiled by Arrian from Epictetus's teachings, remains one of the most read and most useful philosophy books in the world, more than 1900 years after it was written. Final reflection. My friends, the story of Epictetus is unlike any other we have told in this series. Leonidas showed us physical courage. Isabella showed us political will. Charlemagne showed us the power of a civilizing vision. Tesla showed us the boundless creativity of a liberated mind. Epictetus shows us something different. He shows us that freedom is not something that is given to you or taken from you by external circumstances. It is something you build, or fail to build, in the privacy of your own mind. It is the daily practice of asking, what is mine and what is not mine? What can I govern and what must I accept? Where am I wasting energy fighting battles that cannot be won? And where am I neglecting the one battlefield where my victory is always possible? He shows us that the most enslaved person in the world can be inwardly free, and that the most powerful person in the world can be inwardly a slave, subject to every fear, every desire, every fluctuation of fortune that their position exposes them to. He shows us that philosophy is not an academic exercise for comfortable people with time on their hands. It is a survival tool. It is the technology of the self. It is what a human being needs, perhaps more than anything else, to live with dignity and purpose in a world that will never stop being uncertain, painful, and beyond our control. And he shows us, perhaps most movingly of all, that the capacity for wisdom has nothing to do with your social status, your wealth, your education, or your freedom. A slave can understand things that an emperor cannot. A lame man can walk further in the ways that matter than the most physically powerful warrior. Epictetus once said, and I want to leave you with this, my friends, because it is one of the truest things I know. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. That is it. That is the whole philosophy, in 15 words. Everything else is commentary. Take what is yours, your thoughts, your values, your responses, your choices, and use them as well as you possibly can. And everything else, the weather of life, the behavior of other people, the turning of fortune's wheel, take it as it comes, without rage, without despair, without the exhausting and futile attempt to control what was never yours to control. It sounds simple. It is not simple, but it is possible. Epictetus proved it. A slave, in chains, with a broken leg, in the most constrained external circumstances imaginable, proved it. If he could find freedom there, my friends, then perhaps we can find it wherever we are. Thank you so much for listening. I hope your English has grown stronger today, and I hope this story has given you something to carry with you, not just in your mind, but in the way you meet the world tomorrow morning. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and remember, the only thing that is truly yours is how you choose to respond.